The Nemesis of Fire by Algernon Blackwood. Chapter 1. By some means which I could never fathom, John Silence always contrived to keep the compartment to himself, and as the train had a clear run of 2 hours before the first stop, there was ample time to go over the preliminary facts of the case. He had telephoned to me that very morning, and even through the disguise of the miles of wire, the thrill of incalculable adventure had sounded in his voice. As if it were an ordinary country visit, he called in reply to my question, "And don't forget to bring your gun." With blank cartridges, I suppose, for I knew his rigid principles with regard to the taking of life, and guessed that the guns were merely for some obvious purpose of disguise. Then he thanked me for coming, mentioned the train, snapped down the receiver, and left me, vibrating with the excitement of anticipation, to do my packing. For the honor of accompanying Dr. John Silence on one of his big cases was what many would have considered an empty honor, and risky. Certainly, the adventure held all manner of possibilities, and I arrived at Waterloo with the feelings of a man who is about to embark on some dangerous and peculiar mission, in which the dangers he expects to run will not be the ordinary dangers to life and limb, but of some secret character, difficult to name, and still more difficult to cope with. The manor house has a high sound, he told me as we sat with our feet up and talked. But I believe it is little more than an overgrown farmhouse in the desolate heather country beyond Devon, and its owner, Colonel Wragge, a retired soldier with a taste for books, lives there practically alone, I understand, with an elderly invalid sister. So you need not look forward to a lively visit, unless the case provides some excitement of its own. Which is likely. By way of reply, he handed me a letter marked private. It was dated a week ago, and signed, "Yours faithfully, Horace Wragge." He heard of me, you see, through Captain Anderson. The doctor explained modestly, as though his fame were not almost worldwide. You remember that Indian obsession case? I read the letter. Why it should have been marked private was difficult to understand. It was very brief, direct, and to the point. It referred, by way of introduction, to Captain Anderson, and then stated quite simply that the writer needed help of a peculiar kind and asked for a personal interview, a morning interview, since it was impossible for him to be absent from the house at night. The letter was dignified even to the point of abruptness, and it is difficult to explain how it managed to convey to me the impression of a strong man shaken and perplexed. Perhaps the restraint of the wording and the mystery of the affair had something to do with it, and the reference to the Anderson case, the horror of which lay still vivid in my memory, may have touched the sense of something rather ominous and alarming. But whatever the case, there was no doubt that an impression of serious peril rose somehow out of that white paper with a few lines of firm writing, and the spirit of a deep uneasiness ran between the words and reached the mind without any visible form of expression. "And when you saw him?" I asked, returning the letter as the train rushed clattering noisily through Clapham Junction. "I have not seen him," was the reply. "The man's mind was charged to the brim when he wrote that, full of vivid mental pictures. Notice the restraint of it. For the main character of his case, psychometry could be depended upon, and the scrap of paper his hand had touched is sufficient to give another mind, a sensitive and sympathetic mind, clear mental pictures of what is going on. I think I have a very sound general idea of his problem." "So there may be excitement after all." John Silence waited a moment before he replied. "Something very serious is amiss there," he said gravely at length. "Someone, not himself I gather, has been meddling with a rather dangerous kind of gunpowder. So, yes, there may be excitement, as you put it." "And my duties?" I asked with a decidedly growing interest. "Remember, I am your assistant." Behave like an intelligent, confidential secretary. Observe everything without seeming to. Say nothing that means anything. Be present at all interviews. I may ask a good deal of you, for if my impressions are correct, this is—" He broke off suddenly. "But I won't tell you my impressions yet," he resumed after a moment's thought. "Just watch and listen as the case proceeds. Form your own impressions and cultivate your intuitions. We come as ordinary visitors, of course," he added, a twinkle showing for an instant in his eye. "Hence the guns." Though disappointed not to hear more, I recognized the wisdom of his words, and knew how valueless my impressions would be once the powerful suggestion of having heard his own lay behind them. I likewise reflected that intuition joined to a sense of humor was of more use to a man than double the quantity of mere brains as such. Before putting the letter away, however, he handed it back, telling me to place it against my forehead for a few moments, and then describe any pictures that came spontaneously into my mind. Don't deliberately look for anything. Just imagine you see the inside of the eyelid and wait for pictures that rise against its dark screen. I followed his instructions, making my mind as nearly blank as possible, but no visions came. I saw nothing but the lines of light that passed to and fro like the changes of a kaleidoscope across the blackness. A momentary sensation of warmth came and went, curiously. "You see what?" he asked presently. "Nothing," I was obliged to admit disappointedly. "Nothing but the usual flashes of light one always sees, only perhaps they are more vivid than usual." He said nothing by way of comment or reply. "And they group themselves now and then," I continued with painful candor, for I longed to see the pictures he had spoken of. "Group themselves into globes and round balls of fire, and the lines that flash about sometimes look like triangles and crosses, almost like geometrical figures. Nothing more." I opened my eyes again and gave him back the letter. "It makes my head hot," I said, feeling somehow unworthy for not seeing anything of interest, but the look in his eyes arrested my attention at once. "That sensation of heat is important," he said significantly. "It was certainly real and rather uncomfortable," I replied, hoping he would expand and explain. "There was a distinct feeling of warmth, internal warmth, somewhere, oppressive in a sense." "That is interesting," he remarked, putting the letter back in his pocket and settling himself in the corner with newspapers and books. He vouchsafed nothing more, and I knew the uselessness of trying to make him talk. Following his example, I settled likewise with magazines into my corner. But when I closed my eyes again to look for the flashing lights and the sensation of heat, I found nothing but the usual phantasmagoria of the day's events, faces, scenes, memories, and in due course I fell asleep and then saw nothing at all of any kind. When we left the train, after 6 hours traveling, at a little wayside station standing without trees in a world of sand and heather, the late October shadows had already dropped their somber veil upon the landscape, and the sun dipped almost out of sight behind the moorland hills. In a high dog-cart, behind a fast horse, we were soon rattling across the undulating stretches of an open and bleak country, the keen air stinging our cheeks, and the scents of pine and bracken strung about us. Bare hills were faintly visible against the horizon, and the coachman pointed to a bank of distant shadows on our left, where he told us the sea lay. Occasional stone farmhouses, standing back from the road among straggling fir trees, and large black barns that seemed to shift past us with the movement of their own in the gloom, were the only signs of humanity and civilization that we saw, until at the end of a bracing 5 miles the lights of the lodge gates flared before us, and we plunged into a thick grove of pine trees that concealed the manor house up to the moment of actual arrival. Colonel Wragge himself met us in the hall. He was the typical army officer who had seen service, real service, and found himself in the process. He was tall and well built, broad in the shoulders, but lean as a greyhound, with grave eyes, rather stern, and a moustache turning grey. I judged him to be about 60 years of age, but his movements showed a suppleness of strength and agility that contradicted the years. The face was full of character and resolution, the face of a man to be depended upon, and the straight grey eyes, it seemed to me, wore a veil of perplexed anxiety that he made no attempt to disguise. The whole appearance of the man at once clothed the adventure with gravity and importance. A matter that gave such a man cause for serious alarm, I felt, must be something real and of genuine moment. His speech and manner, as he welcomed us, were like his letter, simple and sincere. He had a nature as direct and undeviating as a bullet. Thus he showed plainly his surprise that Dr. Silence had not come alone. "My confidential secretary, Mr. Hubbard," the doctor said, introducing me, and the steady gaze and powerful shake of the hand I then received were well calculated, I remember thinking, to drive home the impression that here was a man who was not to be trifled with, and whose perplexity must spring from some very real and tangible cause. And quite obviously he was relieved that we had come. His welcome was unmistakably genuine. He led us at once into a room, half library, half smoking room, that opened out of the low-ceilinged hall. The manor house gave the impression of a rambling and glorified farmhouse, solid, ancient, comfortable, and wholly unpretentious. And so it was. Only the heat of the place struck me as unnatural. This room with the blazing fire may have seemed uncomfortably warm after the long drive through the night air, yet it seemed to me that the hall itself, and the whole atmosphere of the house, breathed a warmth that hardly belonged to well-filled grates or the pipes of hot air and water. It was not the heat of the greenhouse, it was an oppressive heat that somehow got into the head and mind. It stirred a curious sense of uneasiness in me, and I caught myself thinking of the sensation of warmth that had emanated from the letter in the train. I heard him thanking Dr. Silence for having come. There was no preamble, and the exchange of civilities was of the briefest description. Evidently, here was a man who, like my companion, loved action rather than talk. His manner was straightforward and direct. I saw him in a flash, puzzled, worried, harassed into a state of alarm by something he could not comprehend, forced to deal with things he would have preferred to despise, yet facing it all with dogged seriousness, and making no attempt to conceal that he felt secretly ashamed of his incompetence. "So I cannot offer you much entertainment beyond that of my own company, and the queer business that has been going on here, and is still going on," he said, with a slight inclination of the head towards me, by way of including me in his confidence. "I think, Colonel Wragge," replied John Silence impressively, "that we shall none of us find the time hangs heavy. I gather we shall have our hands full." The two men looked at one another for the space of some seconds, and there was an indefinable quality in their silence which, for the first time, made me admit a swift question into my mind, and I wondered a little at my rashness in coming with so little reflection into a big case of this incalculable doctor. But no answer suggested itself, and to withdraw was, of course, inconceivable. The gates had closed behind me now, and the spirit of the adventure was already besieging my mind with its advance guard of 1,000 little hopes and fears. Explaining that he would wait till after dinner to discuss anything serious, as no reference was ever made before his sister, he led the way upstairs and showed us personally to our rooms. And it was just as I was finishing dressing that a knock came at my door, and Dr. Silence entered. He was always what is called a serious man, so that even in moments of comedy you felt he never lost sight of the profound gravity of life. But as he came across the room to me, I caught the expression of his face, and understood in a flash that he was now in his most grave and earnest mood. He looked almost troubled. I stopped fumbling with my black tie and stared. "It is serious," he said, speaking in a low voice. "More so even than I imagined. Colonel Wragge's control over his thoughts concealed a great deal in my psychometrizing of the letter. I looked in to warn you to keep yourself well in hand, generally speaking." "Haunted house?" I asked, conscious of a distinct shiver down my back. But he smiled gravely at the question. "Haunted house of life, more likely," he replied, and a look came into his eyes which I'd only seen there when a human soul was in the toils and he was thick in the fight of rescue. He was stirred in the deeps. "Colonel Wragge or the sister?" I asked hurriedly, for the gong was sounding. "Neither directly," he said from the door. "Something far older, something very, very remote indeed. This thing has to do with the ages, unless I am mistaken greatly, the ages on which the mists of memory have long lain undisturbed." He came across the floor very quickly, with the finger on his lips, looking at me with a peculiar searchingness of gaze. "Are you aware yet of anything odd here?" he asked in a whisper. "Anything you cannot quite define, for instance? Tell me, Hubbard, for I want to know all your impressions. They may help me." I shook my head, avoiding his gaze, for there was something in the eyes that scared me a little. But he was so in earnest that I set my mind keenly searching. "Nothing yet," I replied truthfully, wishing I could confess to a real emotion. "Nothing but the strange heat of the place." He gave a little jump forward in my direction. "The heat again, that's it," he exclaimed, as though glad of my corroboration. "And how would you describe it, perhaps?" he asked quickly, with a hand on the doorknob. "It doesn't seem like ordinary physical heat," I said, casting about in my thoughts for a definition. "More a mental heat," he interrupted, "a glowing of thought and desire, a sort of feverish warmth of the spirit. Isn't that it?" I admitted that he had exactly described my sensations. "Good," he said, as he opened the door, and with an indescribable gesture that combined a warning to be ready with the sign of praise for my correct intuition, he was gone. I hurried after him and found the two men waiting for me in front of the fire. "I ought to warn you," our host was saying as I came in, "that my sister, whom you will meet at dinner, is not aware of the real object of your visit. She is under the impression that we are interested in the same line of study, folklore, and that your researches have led to my seeking acquaintance. She comes to dinner in her chair, you know. It will be a great pleasure to her to meet you both. We have few visitors." So that on entering the dining room, we were prepared to find Miss Wragge already at her place, seated in a sort of bath chair. She was a vivacious and charming old lady, with smiling expression and bright eyes, and she chatted all through dinner with unfailing spontaneity. She had that face, unlined and fresh, that some people carry through life from the cradle to the grave. Her smooth, plump cheeks were all pink and white, and her hair, still dark, was divided into two glossy and sleek halves on either side with a careful parting. She wore gold-rimmed glasses, and at her throat was a large scarab of green jasper that made a very handsome brooch. Her brother and Dr. Silence talked little, so that most of the conversation was carried on between herself and me, and she told me a great deal about the history of the old house, most of which, I fear, I listened to with but half an ear. "And when Cromwell stayed here," she babbled on, "he occupied the very rooms upstairs that used to be mine. But my brother thinks it safer for me to sleep on the ground floor now in case of fire." And this sentence has stayed in my memory only because of the sudden way her brother interrupted her and instantly led the conversation on to another topic. The passing reference to fire seemed to have disturbed him, and thenceforward he directed the talk himself. It was difficult to believe that this lively and animated old lady, sitting beside me and taking so eager an interest in the affairs of life, was practically, we understood, without the use of her lower limbs, and that her whole existence, for years, had been passed between the sofa, the bed, and the bath-chair in which she chatted so naturally at the dinner-table. She made no allusion to her affliction until the dessert was reached, and then, touching a bell, she made us a witty little speech about leaving us like time on noiseless feet, and was wheeled out of the room by the butler and carried off to her apartments at the other end of the house. And the rest of us were not long in following suit, for Dr. Silence and myself were quite as eager to learn the nature of our errand as our host was to impart it to us. He led us down a long flagged passage to a room at the very end of the house, a room provided with double doors, and windows, I saw, heavily shuttered. Books lined the walls on every side, and a large desk in the bow window was piled up with volumes, some open, some shut, some showing scraps of paper stuck between the leaves, and all smothered in a general cataract of untidy foolscap and loose half-sheets. "My study and workroom," explained Colonel Wragge, with a delightful touch of innocent pride, as though he were a very serious scholar. He placed armchairs for us round the fire. "Here," he added significantly, "we shall be safe from interruption, and can talk securely." During dinner, the manner of the doctor had been all that was natural and spontaneous, though it was impossible for me, knowing him as I did, not to be aware that he was subconsciously very keenly alert and already receiving upon the ultra-sensitive surface of his mind various and vivid impressions. And there was now something in the gravity of his face, as well as in the significant tone of Colonel Wragge's speech, and something, too, in the fact that we three were shut away in this private chamber, about to listen to things probably strange, and certainly mysterious, something in all this that touched my imagination sharply, and sent an undeniable thrill along my nerves. Taking the chair indicated by my host, I lit my cigar and waited for the opening of the attack, fully conscious that we were now too far gone in the adventure to admit of withdrawal, and wondering, a little anxiously, where it was going to lead. What I expected precisely, it is hard to say. Nothing definite, perhaps, only the sudden change was dramatic. A few hours before, the prosaic atmosphere of Piccadilly was about me, and now I was sitting in a secret chamber of this remote old building, waiting to hear an account of things that held possibly the genuine heart of terror. I thought of the dreary moors and hills outside, and the dark pine copses soughing in the wind at night. I remembered my companion's singular words up in my bedroom before dinner, and then I turned and noted carefully the stern countenance of the colonel as he faced us and lit his big black cigar before speaking. The threshold of an adventure, I reflected as I waited for the first words, is always the most thrilling moment, until the climax comes. But Colonel Wragge hesitated, mentally, a long time before he began. He talked briefly of our journey, the weather, the country, and other comparatively trivial topics, while he sought about in his mind for an appropriate entry into the subject that was uppermost in the thoughts of all of us. The fact was, he found it a difficult matter to speak of at all, and it was Dr. Silence who finally showed him the way over the hedge. "Mr. Hubbard will take a few notes when you are ready. You won't object," he suggested. "I can give my undivided attention in this way." "By all means," turning to reach some of the loose sheets on the writing-table and glancing at me. He still hesitated a little, I thought. "The fact is," he said apologetically, "I wondered if it was quite fair to trouble you so soon. The daylight might suit you better to hear what I have to tell. Your sleep, I mean, might be less disturbed, perhaps." "I appreciate your thoughtfulness," John Silence replied with his gentle smile, taking command as it were from that moment. "But really we are both quite immune. There is nothing, I think, that could prevent either of us sleeping, except an outbreak of fire, or some such very physical disturbance. Colonel Wragge raised his eyes and looked fixedly at him. This reference to an outbreak of fire I felt sure was made with a purpose. It certainly had the desired effect of removing from our host's manner the last signs of hesitancy. "Forgive me," he said. "Of course I know nothing of your methods in matters of this kind, so perhaps you would like me to begin at once and give you an outline of the situation." Dr. Silence bowed his agreement. "I can then take my precautions accordingly," he added calmly. The soldier looked up for a moment, as though he did not quite gather the meaning of these words, but he made no further comment, and turned at once to tackle a subject on which he evidently talked with diffidence and unwillingness. "It's all so utterly out of my line of things," he began, puffing out clouds of cigar smoke between his words, "and there's so little to tell, with any real evidence behind it, that it's almost impossible to make a consecutive story for you. It's the total cumulative effect that is so disquieting." He chose his words with care, as though determined not to travel one hair's breadth beyond the truth. "I came into this place 20 years ago, when my elder brother died," he continued, "but could not afford to live here then. My sister, whom you met at dinner, kept house for him till the end, and during all these years, while I was seeing service abroad, she had an eye to the place, for we never got a satisfactory tenant, and saw that it was not allowed to go to ruin. I myself took possession, however, only a year ago. My brother," he went on after a perceptible pause, "spent much of his time away too. He was a great traveller, and filled the house with stuff he brought home from all over the world. The laundry, a small detached building beyond the servants' quarters, he turned into a regular little museum. The curios and things I have cleared away. They collected dust and were always getting broken. But the laundry house you shall see tomorrow." Colonel Wragge spoke with such deliberation, and with so many pauses, that this beginning took him a long time. But at this point he came to a full stop altogether. Evidently there was something he wished to say that cost him considerable effort. At length he looked up steadily into my companion's face. "May I ask you, that is, if you won't think it strange," he said, and a sort of hush came over his voice and manner, "whether you have noticed anything at all unusual, anything queer, since you came into the house?" Dr. Silence answered without a moment's hesitation. "I have," he said. "There is a curious sensation of heat in the place." "Ah!" exclaimed the other with a slight start. "You have noticed it. This unaccountable heat." "But its cause, I gather, is not in the house itself, but outside." I was astonished to hear the doctor add. Colonel Wragge rose from his chair and turned to unhook a framed map that hung upon the wall. I got the impression that the movement was made with the deliberate purpose of concealing his face. "Your diagnosis, I believe, is amazingly accurate," he said after a moment, turning round with the map in his hands, "though, of course, I can have no idea how you should guess." John Silence shrugged his shoulders expressively. "Merely my impression," he said. "If you pay attention to impressions, and do not allow them to be confused by deductions of the intellect, you will often find them surprisingly, uncannily accurate." Colonel Wragge resumed his seat and laid the map upon his knees. His face was very thoughtful as he plunged abruptly again into his story. "On coming into possession," he said, looking us alternately in the face, "I found a crop of stories of the most extraordinary and impossible kind I have ever heard. Stories which at first I treated with amused indifference, but later was forced to regard seriously, if only to keep my servants. These stories I thought I traced to the fact of my brother's death, and, in a way, I think so still." He leant forward and handed the map to Dr. Silence. "It's an old plan of the estate," he explained, "but accurate enough for our purpose, and I wish you would note the position of the plantations marked upon it, especially those near the house. That one," indicating the spot with his finger, "is called the 12-acre plantation. It was just there, on the side nearest the house, that my brother and the head keeper met their deaths." He spoke as a man forced to recognize facts that he deplored, and would have preferred to leave untouched, things he personally would rather have treated with ridicule if possible. It made his words peculiarly dignified and impressive, and I listened with an increasing uneasiness as to the sort of help the doctor would look to me for later. It seemed as though I were a spectator of some drama of mystery in which any moment I might be summoned to play a part. "It was 20 years ago," continued the Colonel, "but there was much talk about it at the time, unfortunately, and you may perhaps have heard of the affair. Stride, the keeper, was a passionate, hot-tempered man, but I regret to say so was my brother, and quarrels between them seem to have been frequent." "I do not recall the affair," said the doctor. "May I ask what was the cause of death?" Something in his voice made me prick up my ears for the reply. "The keeper, it was said, from suffocation, and at the inquest the doctors averred that both men had been dead the same length of time when found." "And your brother?" asked John Silence, noticing the omission and listening intently. "Equally mysterious," said our host, speaking in a low voice with effort. "But there was one distressing feature I think I ought to mention. For those who saw the face, I did not see it myself, and though Stride carried a gun, its chambers were undischarged." He stammered and hesitated with confusion. Again that sense of terror moved between his words. He stuck. "Yes?" said the chief listener sympathetically. "My brother's face, they said, looked as though it had been scorched. It had been swept, as it were, by something that burned, blasted. It was, I am told, quite dreadful. The bodies were found lying side by side, faces downwards, both pointing away from the wood as though they had been in the act of running, and not more than a dozen yards from its edge." Dr. Silence made no comment. He appeared to be studying the map attentively. "I did not see the face myself," repeated the other, his manner somehow expressing the sense of awe he contrived to keep out of his voice. "But my sister unfortunately did, and her present state I believe to be entirely due to the shock it gave to her nerves. She never can be brought to refer to it, naturally, and I am even inclined to think that the memory has mercifully been permitted to vanish from her mind. But she spoke of it at the time as a face swept by flame, blasted." John Silence looked up from his contemplation of the map, but with the air of one who wished to listen, not to speak, and presently Colonel Wragge went on with his account. He stood on the mat, his broad shoulders hiding most of the mantelpiece. "They all centered about this particular plantation, these stories. That was to be expected, for the people here are as superstitious as Irish peasantry, and though I made one or two examples among them to stop the foolish talk, it had no effect, and new versions came to my ears every week. You may imagine how little good dismissals did when I tell you that the servants dismissed themselves. It was not the house servants, but the men who worked on the estate outside. The keepers gave notice one after another, none of them with any reason I could accept. The foresters refused to enter the wood, and the beaters to beat it. Word flew all over the countryside that 12-acre plantation was a place to be avoided, day or night. There came a point, the Colonel went on, now well in his swing, when I felt compelled to make investigations on my own account. I could not kill the thing by ignoring it, so I collected and analyzed the stories at first hand. But this 12-acre wood, you will see by the map, comes rather near home. Its lower end, if you will look, almost touches the end of the back lawn, as I will show you tomorrow, and its dense growth of pines forms the chief protection the house enjoys from the east winds that blow up from the sea. And in olden days, before my brother interfered with it and frightened all the game away, it was one of the best pheasant coverts on the whole estate. And what form, if I may ask, did this interference take? Asked Dr. Silence. In detail I cannot tell you, for I do not know, except that I understand it was the subject of his frequent differences with the head keeper. But during the last 2 years of his life, when he gave up traveling and settled down here, he took a special interest in this wood, and for some unaccountable reason began to build a low stone wall around it. This wall was never finished, but you shall see the ruins tomorrow in the daylight. And the result of your investigations, these stories, I mean. The doctor broke in, anxious to keep him to the main issues. Yes, I'm coming to that, he said slowly. But the wood first, for this wood, out of which they grew like mushrooms, has nothing in any way peculiar about it. It is very thickly grown, and rises to a clearer part in the center, a sort of mound, where there is a circle of large boulders, old Druid stones, I'm told. At another place there's a small pond. There is nothing distinctive about it that I could mention, just an ordinary pine wood, a very ordinary pine wood. Only the trees are a bit twisted in the trunks, some of them, and very dense. Nothing more. And the stories, well, none of them had anything to do with my poor brother or the keeper, as you might have expected. And they were all odd, such odd things, I mean, to invent or imagine. I never could make out how these people got such notions into their heads. He paused a moment to relight his cigar. There's no regular path through it, he resumed, puffing vigorously. But the fields round it are constantly used, and one of the gardeners, whose cottage lies over that way, declared he often saw moving lights in it at night, and luminous shapes like globes of fire over the tops of the trees, skimming and floating and making a soft hissing sound. Most of them said that, in fact, and another man saw shapes flitting in and out among the trees, things that were neither men nor animals, and all faintly luminous. No one ever pretended to see human forms, always queer, huge things they could not properly describe. Sometimes the whole wood was lit up, and one fellow, he's still here, and you shall see him, has a most circumstantial yarn about having seen great stars lying on the ground round the edge of the wood at regular intervals. What kind of stars? Put in John Silence sharply, in a sudden way that made me start. Oh, I don't know quite. Ordinary stars, I think he said, only very large and apparently blazing, as though the ground was alight. He was too terrified to go close and examine, and he has never seen them since. He stooped and stirred the fire into a welcome blaze, welcome for its blaze of light rather than for its heat. In the room there was already a strange pervading sensation of warmth that was oppressive in its effect and far from comforting. Of course, he went on, straightening up again on the mat, this was all commonplace enough. This seeing lights and figures at night. Most of these fellows drink, and imagination and terror between them may account for almost anything. But others saw things in broad daylight. One of the woodmen, a sober, respectable man, took the short cut home to his midday meal and swore he was followed the whole length of the wood by something that never showed itself, but dodged from tree to tree, always keeping out of sight, yet solid enough to make the branches sway and the twigs snap on the ground. And it made a noise, he declared, but really— The speaker stopped and gave a short laugh. It's too absurd. Please, insisted the doctor, for it is these small details that give me the best clues always. It made a crackling noise, he said, like a bonfire. Those were his very words, like the crackling of a bonfire," finished the soldier with a repetition of his short laugh. "Most interesting," Dr. Silence observed gravely. "Please omit nothing." "Yes," he went on, "and it was soon after that the fires began, the fires in the wood. They started mysteriously burning in the patches of coarse white grass that cover the more open parts of the plantation. No one ever actually saw them start, but many, myself among the number, have seen them burning and smoldering. They are always small and circular in shape, and for all the world like a picnic fire. The head keeper has a dozen explanations, from sparks flying out of the house chimneys to the sunlight focusing through a dewdrop, but none of them, I must admit, convince me as being in the least likely or probable. They are most singular, I consider, most singular, these mysterious fires, and I am glad to say that they come only at rather long intervals and never seem to spread." But the keeper had other queer stories as well, and about things that are verifiable. He declared that no life ever willingly entered the plantation, more, that no life existed in it at all. No birds nested in the trees or flew into their shade. He set countless traps, but never caught so much as a rabbit or a weasel. Animals avoided it, and more than once he had picked up dead creatures round the edges that bore no obvious signs of how they had met their death. Moreover, he told me one extraordinary tale about his retriever chasing some invisible creature across the field one day when he was out with his gun. The dog suddenly pointed at something in the field at his feet, and then gave chase, yelping like a mad thing. It followed its imaginary quarry to the borders of the wood, and then went in, a thing he had never known it to do before. The moment it crossed the edge, it is darkish in there even in daylight, it began fighting in the most frenzied and terrific fashion. It made him afraid to interfere, he said, and at last, when the dog came out, hanging its tail down and panting, he found something like white hair stuck to its jaws, and brought it to show me. I tell you these details because— "They are important, believe me." The doctor stopped him. "And do you have it still, this hair?" he asked. "It disappeared in the oddest way," the colonel explained. "It was curious-looking stuff, something like asbestos, and I sent it to be analyzed by the local chemist. But either the man got wind of its origin, or else he didn't like the look of it for some reason, because he returned it to me and said it was neither animal, vegetable, nor mineral, so far as he could make out, and he didn't wish to have anything to do with it. I put it away in paper, but a week later, on opening the package, it was gone. Oh, the stories are simply endless. I could tell you hundreds, all on the same lines." "And personal experiences of your own, Colonel Wragge?" asked John Silence earnestly, his manner showing the greatest possible interest and sympathy. The soldier gave an almost imperceptible start. He looked distinctly uncomfortable. "Nothing, I think," he said slowly. "Nothing I should like to rely on. I mean, nothing I have the right to speak of. Perhaps yet." His mouth closed with a snap. Dr. Silence, after waiting a little to see if he would add to his reply, did not seek to press him on the point. "Well," he resumed presently, and as though he would speak contemptuously, yet dared not, "this sort of thing has gone on at intervals ever since. It spreads like wildfire, of course, mysterious chatter of this kind, and people began trespassing all over the estate, coming to see the wood and making themselves a general nuisance. Notices of man-traps and spring guns only seemed to increase their persistence, and think of it," he snorted, "some local research society actually wrote and asked permission for one of their members to spend a night in the wood. Bolder fools who didn't write for leave came and took away bits of bark from the trees and gave them to clairvoyants, who invented in their turn a further batch of tales. There was simply no end to it all." Most distressing and annoying, I can well believe, interposed the doctor. Then suddenly the phenomena ceased as mysteriously as they had begun, and the interest flagged. The tale stopped. People got interested in something else. It all seemed to die out. This was last July. I can tell you exactly, for I've kept a diary more or less of what happened. Ah! But now, quite recently, within the past 3 weeks, it has all revived again with a rush, with a kind of furious attack, so to speak. It has really become unbearable. You may imagine what it means, and the general state of affairs, when I say that the possibility of leaving has occurred to me. Incendiarism, suggested Dr. Silence, half under his breath, but not so low that Colonel Wragge did not hear him. By Jove, sir, you take the very words out of my mouth, exclaimed the astonished man, glancing from the doctor to me, and from me to the doctor, and rattling the money in his pocket, as though some explanation of my friend's divining powers were to be found that way. It's only that you are thinking very vividly, the doctor said quietly, and your thoughts form pictures in my mind before you utter them. It's merely a little elementary thought-reading. His intention, I saw, was not to perplex the good man, but to impress him with his powers so as to ensure obedience later. Good Lord! I had no idea. He did not finish the sentence, and dived again abruptly into his narrative. I did not see anything myself, I must admit, but the stories of independent eyewitnesses were to the effect that lines of light, like streams of thin fire, moved through the wood, and sometimes were seen to shoot out precisely as flames might shoot out in the direction of this house. There, he explained in a louder voice that made me jump, pointing with the thick finger to the map, where the westerly fringe of the plantation comes up to the end of the lower lawn at the back of the house, where it links onto those dark patches, which are laurel shrubberies, running right up to the back of the premises, that's where these lights were seen. They passed from the wood to the shrubberies, and in this way reached the house itself. Like silent rockets, one man described them, rapid as lightning and exceedingly bright. And this evidence you spoke of? They actually reached the sides of the house. They've left a mark of scorching on the walls of the laundry building at the other end. You shall see 'em tomorrow. He pointed to the map to indicate the spot, and then straightened himself and glared about the room as though he had said something no one could believe and expected contradiction. Scorched, just as the faces were, the doctor murmured, looking significantly at me. Scorched, yes, repeated the colonel, failing to catch the rest of the sentence in his excitement. There was a prolonged silence in the room, in which I heard the gurgling of the oil in the lamp, and the click of the coals, and the heavy breathing of our host. The most unwelcome sensations were creeping about my spine, and I wondered whether my companion would scorn me utterly if I asked to sleep on the sofa in his room. It was 11 o'clock, I saw by the clock on the mantelpiece. We had crossed the dividing line, and were now well in the movement of the adventure. The fight between my interest and my dread became acute. But even if turning back had been possible, I think the interest would have easily gained the day. I have enemies, of course, I heard the colonel's rough voice break into the pause presently, and have discharged a number of servants. It's not that, put in John Silence briefly. You think not. In a sense, I am glad, and yet there are some things that can be met and dealt with. He left the sentence unfinished, and looked down at the floor with an expression of grim severity that betrayed a momentary glimpse of character. This fighting man loathed and abhorred the thought of an enemy he could not see and come to grips with. Presently he moved over and sat down in the chair between us. Something like a sigh escaped him. Dr. Silence said nothing. My sister, of course, is kept in ignorance, as far as possible, of all this, he said disconnectedly, as if talking to himself. But even if she knew, she would find matter-of-fact explanations. I only wish I could. I'm sure they exist. There came an interval in the conversation that was very significant. It did not seem a real pause, or the silence real silence, for both men continued to think so rapidly and strongly that one almost imagined their thoughts clothed themselves in words in the air of the room. I was more than a little keyed up with the strange excitement of all I had heard, but what stimulated my nerves more than anything else was the obvious fact that the doctor was clearly upon the trail of discovery. In his mind at that moment, I believe, he had already solved the nature of this perplexing psychical problem. His face was like a mask, and he employed the absolute minimum of gesture and words. All his energies were directed inwards, and by those incalculable methods and processes he had mastered with such infinite patience and study, I felt sure he was already in touch with the forces behind these singular phenomena, and laying his deep plans for bringing them into the open, and then effectively dealing with them. Colonel Wragge, meanwhile, grew more and more fidgety. From time to time he turned towards my companion as though about to speak, yet always changing his mind at the last moment. Once he went over and opened the door suddenly, apparently to see if anyone were listening at the keyhole, for he disappeared a moment between the two doors, and then I heard him open the outer one. He stood there for some seconds and made a noise as though he were sniffing the air like a dog. Then he closed both doors cautiously and came back to the fireplace. A strange excitement seemed growing upon him. Evidently he was trying to make up his mind to say something that he found it difficult to say, and John Silence, as I rightly judged, was waiting patiently for him to choose his own opportunity and his own way of saying it. At last he turned and faced us, squaring his great shoulders and stiffening perceptibly. Dr. Silence looked up sympathetically. "Your own experiences help me most," he observed quietly. "The fact is," the colonel said, speaking very low, "this past week there have been outbreaks of fire in the house itself. 3 separate outbreaks, and all in my sister's room." "Yes," the doctor said, as if this was just what he had expected to hear. "Utterly unaccountable, all of them," added the other, and then sat down. I began to understand something of the reason of his excitement. He was realizing at last that the natural explanation he had held to all along was becoming impossible, and he hated it. It made him angry. "Fortunately," he went on, "she was out each time and does not know, but I have made her sleep now in a room on the ground floor." "A wise precaution," the doctor said simply. He asked 1 or 2 questions. The fires had started in the curtains, once by the window and once by the bed. The 3rd time, smoke had been discovered by the maid coming from the cupboard, and it was found that Miss Wragge's clothes hanging on the hooks were smouldering. The doctor listened attentively, but made no comment. "And now you can tell me," he said presently, "what your own feeling about it is. Your general impression." "It sounds foolish to say so," replied the soldier after a moment's hesitation, "but I feel exactly as I have often felt on active service in my Indian campaigns, just as if the house and all in it were in a state of siege, as though a concealed enemy were encamped about us, in ambush somewhere." He uttered a soft, nervous laugh, "as if the next sign of smoke would precipitate a panic. A dreadful panic." The picture came before me of the night shadowing the house, and the twisted pine trees he had described crowding about it, concealing some powerful enemy, and glancing at the resolute face and figure of the old soldier, forced at length to his confession, I understood something of all he had been through before he sought the assistance of John Silence. "And tomorrow, unless I am mistaken, is full moon," said the doctor suddenly, watching the other's face for the effect of his apparently careless words. Colonel Wragge gave an uncontrollable start, and his face for the first time showed unmistakable pallor. "What in the world?" he began, his lip quivering. "Only that I am beginning to see light in this extraordinary affair," returned the other calmly, "and if my theory is correct, each month when the moon is at the full should witness an increase in the activity of the phenomena." "I don't see the connection," Colonel Wragge answered almost savagely, "but I am bound to say my diary bears you out." He wore the most puzzled expression I have ever seen upon an honest face, but he abhorred this additional corroboration of an explanation that perplexed him. "I confess," he repeated, "I cannot see the connection." "Why should you?" said the doctor, with his first laugh that evening. He got up and hung the map upon the wall again. "But I do, because these things are my special study, and let me add that I have yet to come across a problem that is not natural and has not a natural explanation. It's merely a question of how much one knows and admits." Colonel Wragge eyed him with a new and curious respect in his face, but his feelings were soothed. Moreover, the doctor's laugh and change of manner came as a relief to all, and broke the spell of grave suspense that had held us so long. We all rose and stretched our limbs, and took little walks about the room. "I am glad, Dr. Silence, if you will allow me to say so, that you are here," he said simply. "Very glad indeed. And now I fear I have kept you both up very late," with a glance to include me, "for you must be tired and ready for your beds. I have told you all there is to tell," he added, "and tomorrow you must feel perfectly free to take any steps you think necessary." The end was abrupt yet natural, for there was nothing more to say, and neither of these men talked for mere talking's sake. Out in the cold and chilly hall he lit our candles and took us upstairs. The house was at rest and still, everyone asleep. We moved softly. Through the windows on the stairs we saw the moonlight falling across the lawn, throwing deep shadows. The nearer pine trees were just visible in the distance, a wall of impenetrable blackness. Our host came for a moment to our rooms to see that we had everything. He pointed to a coil of strong rope lying beside the window, fastened to the wall by means of an iron ring. Evidently it had been recently put in. "I don't think we shall need it," Dr. Silence said with a smile. "I trust not," replied our host gravely. "I sleep quite close to you across the landing," he whispered, pointing to his door, "and if you want anything in the night, you will know where to find me." He wished us pleasant dreams, and disappeared down the passage into his room, shading the candle with his big muscular hand from the draughts. John Silence stopped me a moment before I went. "You know what it is?" I asked, with an excitement that even overcame my wariness. "Yes," he said, "I'm almost sure. And you?" "Not the smallest notion." He looked disappointed, but not half as disappointed as I felt. "Egypt," he whispered. "Egypt."